Today on the Big 3 in 30, which quarterback is set to step up in the NFC South?
Feels like it's always about the quarterback position.
The Cowboys could have the best safeties in the NFL.
What do we expect from these two veterans going into training camp?
And the Steelers want to make tight end Darnell Washington a key piece this year.
Question about the Steelers style of offense.
This is the Big 3 in 30 NFL, the three biggest stories in the NFL from our local experts at the Locked On Podcast Network. We bring you the real story, why it matters, what's next, who wins the big game, and more, all in 30 minutes. The Big 3 in 30 NFL starts now. Thank you for making the Big 3 in 30 your first listen of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The Falcons are searching for a quarterback who can be the answer in the NFC South, with Michael Penix Jr. and Tua Tagovailoa under the spotlight with that team. Aaron Freeman with Locked On Falcons joins Julian Council with Locked On Panthers to break down who can separate.
Feels like it's always about the quarterback position, particularly in this division, regardless of what team you wind up covering. And sort of the future of Bryce Young, is he the guy? There was some concerns heading into the offseason, some questions on whether or not Carolina would pick up that fifth-year option. They obviously did, locking them into nearly $26 million in guaranteed money in the 2027 season. Do you, in your eyes, when you look at this quarterback situation, is this a continued audition for Bryce Young to be the long-term answer at quarterback? Is this a one-year situation, or by picking up that fifth-year option, he's going to have the runway to really kind of get those 2 years to prove himself?
Yeah, this is still going to be an audition for Bryce Young. And it's interesting because they've been asked about that. They being Dan Morgan, the Panthers general manager, and Brent Tillis, who's the Panthers EVP of football operations, handles salary cap and contracts. They've been asked multiple times this offseason about whether they've had any sort of long-term negotiations with Bryce Young. And they've either not answered the question or they've said, we're just not there yet. And it is interesting, too, because I go back to a quote that Dan Morgan had when he was on with Kay Adams of the Up and Adams show on FanDuel Sports Network. And she asked about the fifth-year option. And he said, yeah, we picked up the fifth-year option, and Bryce is definitely our future. And I can't get that out of my mind. He said verbatim, Bryce is definitely our future, but their actions say he's Mr. Right Now, as in he's going to start this year, and they're paying him about $25 million next season, $31.8 across the next 2 years to be their starting quarterback, and then we'll see. I do think it really comes down to how he performs this year. We've seen a cadence in Carolina recently. Derek Brown, fifth-year option extension. J.C. Horn, fifth-year option extension. Ike Ekwonu, had he not gotten hurt, would have been a fifth-year option and extension. Bryce Young next in line. He's going to have to play, I think, a lot better just as far as consistency-wise, in order to get the mega extension that he would like to have. I would think right now the kind of deal he's probably deserving of, if Carolina gets the same kind of season they got from last year back in the playoff hunt and all that, would probably be what Sam Darnold, Baker Mayfield got their first time around, their most recent contracts, where it's okay, we'll commit to you for about a year or two, but we're not going to do anything past that. And for the team, I don't think it's really necessary for them to do that, considering they're getting him for $31.8 million next 2 seasons. And for the player, yeah, you want to make more than that. So I think it's still an audition. You look at a lot of the advanced analytics, and they're not really favorable when it comes to Bryce. Last season, he was 28th in EPA per drop back. He's 23rd in success rate. But the thing about him is, in crunch time, he's clutch. He was second in the league with game-winning drives of 7 last year. And since he came into the league since 2023, he's had more game-winning drives than anyone in the NFL at that quarterback position. So he may not go out there and throw for a ton of yardage, but late in the season, the last 2 years, he's been nails for them. And he's had the moments where late in the games, you need to make a play, he's made the play. So yeah, it's an audition, and it's kind of just really hard to gauge where exactly he stands long-term with this organization at this point in time.
Well, all I'll say is hopefully for Bryce Young, his agent will be negotiating immediately after they play the Atlanta Falcons, because he always looks like a superstar against
week 2.
Yeah. Week 18 as well. So looking forward to those 2 games. So we heard from Julian Council. Let's hear from Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints to discuss how the Saints offseason moves are pointing to this being an all-important evaluation year for a second-year quarterback. Well, Ross, let's jump right into it. It feels like 2026 is really all about finding out if Tyler Shuck is the answer at quarterback. As we've discussed on a previous episode, looking at the Saints offseason moves, they did a lot of, in free agency, in the draft, trying to add pass catchers, beef up that offensive line. to really support Tyler Shuck. And do you feel like they did enough this offseason to set him up for success? And basically, is this the season where we get a full referendum on if Tyler Shuck is the long-term answer for the Saints at the quarterback?
Yeah, I think that's the goal. I think that's the plan, right? Like you said, they put pass catchers around him. They helped his protection. They gave him a running back to take some pressure off. We'll see what happens with Alvin Kamara as they move forward in the midst of all that. But I think so. I think that they have done enough. They've certainly done enough to get an evaluation. There's no doubt about that. Did they do enough to, help themselves get to a certain level? That we'll have to wait and see. But when it comes to, evaluating Tyler Shuck, when you go in and you draft 3 wide receivers, you draft a tight end, you sign another tight end, you sign a $12 million per year running back, and you bring in a big ticket offensive lineman. Yeah, you're giving that quarterback, or you're giving yourself enough around that quarterback to get a real evaluation on them. I think that's what 2026 is all going to be about, while also trying to compete, right? This is a team that wants to compete in the division going into 2026 for sure. But I think this is also the year where you really find out, is Tyler Shuck the guy after a promising, 9-start season last year, winning 4 of his last 5?
We touched upon earlier, Julian, when we broke down the Panthers all-season moves. There are 2 big additions on that side of the ball, paying a big premium for guys like Jalen Phillips and Devin Lloyd. And now, is it kind of feel like, okay, this defense has come a long way from where they were like historically bad 2 years ago to, hey, they were just like solid, competent, a functional NFL defense last year. Are these the 2 pieces to kind of get this unit to play at their best and return the days of what it was for many years during the Ron Rivera era of, top-notch defenses?
You would certainly hope at this point in time that they finally have the requisite talent to be the kind of defense people have really expected here in the 30-plus years of Carolina Panther football. I know 2 years ago was a disaster in large part because, Derek Brown was injured that first game of the season, and they had no depth on the defensive interior, among other issues that they had that season where it was an unmitigated disaster. Unbeknownst to all of us until this past January, after that season, Ejiro Rivera, the DC, secretly was extended, which is wild to me how someone who's coaching a team in the NFL, which is supposed to be a meritocracy, can earn an extension after overseeing historically the worst scoring defense in the history of the National Football League. Like, that's mind-blowing, but that's something that they did. And Dave Canales, though, if you were willing to listen, which a lot of Panther fans, they weren't. They were blinded by hatred and their embarrassment of their team being awful defensively. Dave continuously said he had no issue with the scheme, said the scheme was not the problem. So if the problem's not the scheme, then it must be the personnel. In the personnel, you didn't have Derek Brown. Edge rusher-wise, you had moved on from Brian Burns. I'm sorry, Jadeveon Clowney has never been the guy we thought he was going to be coming out of South Carolina, and he's not better than Brian Burns. So I never thought the talent was great. They've had injuries there, understand all of that. Last year, it was better. But it couldn't go anywhere but up after being historically the worst. Now you look at every single level of that defense. You have Derek Brown, one of the best defensive tackles in football. You have Jalen Phillips, who is a proven edge rusher. You have Nick Scott, who looks like he can be the next guy in line there. You have Devin Lloyd, one of the best linebackers in football last season. You also now have J.C. Horn, Mike Jackson, underrated duo there at corner. And I think Trevon Berg's a pretty good player at safety. Every single level, every single position group on that defense, you have a dude. There's no more excuses. Go out there, get it done. So I think they have the possibility of doing that, but is it going to happen overnight? I certainly don't think their pass rush all of a sudden is going to be great. It's not just adding Phillips, but everybody else has to get better. Schematically, that's not really something that he values that much as far as pass rush. It's about being able to set the edge, stop the run, which makes sense and all of that. But I think they should be better. I just don't know if they're going to be that top 10 kind of dominant defense a lot of people here want to see and maybe are expecting to see when you sign big names like Phillips and like Lloyd when you already have J.C. Horn and Derek Brown.
When it comes to this upcoming season, obviously the Panthers go 8-9, win the division on a technicality, and make the playoffs. And, I'm curious, this is what, year 3 for Dave Canales?
Year 3, yeah.
Okay. Is this kind of, and I asked this question just because, the Panthers owner is David Tepper and he has a reputation. Maybe he's trying to, get out of that space. But
yeah,
I'm curious, is Dave Canales potentially on the hot seat if they don't improve upon last year's record?
I don't think so. I think he's pretty secure at this point in time. The fact that this is a guy that nobody wanted to interview 2 years ago, and he's come to Carolina and he's turned a team that went 2-15 and got them to win 5 games, had Bryce Young playing good football at the end of that 24 season. Then last year they got off to a horrible start, started off 1-3, and they still were able, even though every opportunity they had to take over the division and handle it themselves, they decided, no, let's leave it into the hands of the Falcons there in week 18. He still got them to the playoffs. So you're going from a team where 2023, Frank Reich's fired after 11 games. Bryce Young looks awful. Everyone's talking about, they made a wrong decision by not taking CJ Stroud. To 2 years later, they're in the playoffs, and now they've added Phillips and Lloyd, and there's a lot of positive momentum. I don't think there's any sort. I mean, he'd have to completely just tank and go 2-15, 1-16 for that to happen. I have a hard time seeing with the talent that they have now, and also like the depth that they brought back, that this team's just going to fall off the cliff and end up being that kind of team. I do think that they need to get right back to where they were last year, not being the playoff team, but at least winning 8 games. You don't want to go back down and only win 5 or 6 games. You want to be able to, at least with the schedule you're playing, which I don't think is any more difficult than the one they ended up actually playing last year, be an 8-9 team, maybe get to 9-8. I'm not expecting them to have another 3-win jump and go up to 11 wins this season. Just being able to kind of plateau and still be competitive and just have a normal year, I think that's going to be good enough for Dave. And I don't think he's anywhere close to being on the hot seat again, unless things just completely just blow up in his face.
Workplace chaos can show up fast. The problem is that finding the right candidate can take a lot more time than most businesses can afford. That's where Indeed Sponsored Jobs comes in. Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps you reach candidates who actually fit what you're looking for based on skills, experience, and location. Finding the right person can make all the difference, whether it's building a business or building a winning team. Some of the best moves organizations make aren't always the splashiest ones. Sometimes it's finding the person who fits exactly what the team needs at the right moment. That's what stood out to me here, and it's the same idea behind Indeed Sponsored Jobs, helping connect organizations with candidates who are the right fit from the start. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, this is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. And listeners to this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your premium status you deserve at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Welcome back to the Big 3 and 30 NFL. The Cowboys believe Caleb Downs and Jalen Thompson could give Dallas one of the NFL's best safety rooms. Marcus Mosher and Landon McCool with Locked On Cowboys get into it.
I want to start with Jalen Thompson and Malik Hooker. What do we expect from these two veterans going into training camp?
Well, we don't need to spend too much time on Malik Hooker. I mean, obviously, if you've been listening to this podcast, you're very familiar with the player. He's been with the Cowboys for several years through several defensive coordinators at this point. And I still feel like that he was one of the few players last year that still was managing to play at a certainly not up to his normal level, but at a level that was at least respectable considering how terrible the rest of the defense was. And he was one of the few guys where I was like, I thought that the Cowboys should have brought him back just because I think he could provide solid safety play at the very least. And I think that, so we've seen a lot about him. I'm expecting him to have a little bit of a bounce back here because the system will be better and he'll be operating it. Very solid, high floor player. I think the guy that we, kind of need to talk about more than that is Jalen Thompson, just because there's a lot of unfamiliarity there. And Jalen Thompson was a really interesting case. And it's funny, we talked about the Brendan Sorsby situation, but the actual last supplemental draft player to come out was Jalen Thompson from the University of Washington. And it's funny to go back and kind of research why he had to come out, because he got popped for buying an over-the-counter non-steroid banned substance from the NCAA, which seems so quaint nowadays, like such a small potato situation. But before that, he was a freshman starter, a phenom in that Washington defense. I think he was an All-American as a freshman, if I'm not mistaken. And then sophomore and juniors were great, and then he lost his senior year because of this whole situation, and ends up getting picked by Arizona in the 5th round of the supplemental draft. And he's just an extremely well-rounded player, and that sometimes you can say that, and it could be kind of a backhanded compliment a little bit. But it's not the case necessarily with Thompson. Like, he is extremely versatile, and because he's had to play opposite of a guy like Budda Baker, he's had to be able to mirror that kind of flexibility all over that defense. And so you've seen him play a lot of different stuff. Even in Washington, they were trying to move him at one point to the nickel, I think, for his senior year because he was so versatile, playing the back end, playing strong safety. He's an extremely solid tackler. He's not like he doesn't have huge production numbers on the football necessarily. Part of that is because he's played in Arizona, which has had kind of really up and down defenses at times. But he's got extremely high tackle numbers. He simply does not miss tackles. And like I said, he has a ton of experience, a ton of starting experience all throughout college and the pros, playing all over the secondary in a couple different schemes.
Yeah, I love Jalen Thompson. We were fired up when the Cowboys signed him because he is one of these guys that isn't a household name by any stretch, but people that really watch a lot of film or just watch a lot of football in general always see him making plays. And you're right. I'm glad that you brought up the Budda Baker comp, because if you have just one player in your secondary that's versatile, that's great. But you can't really do a ton with that, because if your other guys are locked into spots, you really can't move that player around. But if you've got two guys back there, that's what makes them really dangerous. And I go back to like the early 2000s Cowboys that had Darren Woodson and Roy Williams. This was all pro version of Roy Williams. Yes. And they could do a lot. They could move one Roy Williams free safety. They could have Darren Woodson play in the slot. They could have Roy Williams be a linebacker. Because they had two guys that were extremely versatile, it made defense really fun for the Cowboys. And I think the hope is, now that you've got Jalen Thompson and you've got someone like Caleb Downs, I got to believe that the Cowboys are planning on having those two guys be like the future of the secondary, whether it's like just this year or over the next couple of years. I think the idea is two guys that can play anywhere on the football field. You pair them together. Now Christian Parker can work his magic.
Yeah, and they're going to play a lot of free safety too, so you add in Hooker there. So whether he needs to play down when Hooker's in, whether he needs to play up when he's not, he could do both of that. He could rotate down into the slot if there's like motion rules that kind of force him there. He's just has a lot of experience doing a lot of different things at a pretty high level. Maybe not at the Pro Bowl level, but at a plus starter level. And again, I think that was one of the underrated, not to get too much into Caleb Downs again, but that was one of the underrated things about how awesome it is that Caleb Downs came to the Cowboys, is because they already had a player in their secondary that's ready to kind of play the Robin to Caleb Downs Batman as they move these two players around. That was another reason he was such a great fit when he got drafted.
I want to go back to Malik Hooker, because I know you and I are fans, and there's other people out there that maybe have soured on him a little bit. And I think last year wasn't quite as good as it has been over the last couple of years. He turned 30 this year, but he's missed a lot of time with injuries. Now, that hasn't been the case in Dallas. He's actually managed to be one of their healthier players, which is hilarious.
Which is wild, man. It's going to be totally crazy if you know his history.
But part of me does wonder, like, is there a scenario where we get to training camp, Landon, and it's, okay, Jalen Thompson is everything we could have imagined as a free agent addition. Caleb Downs is that transcendent safety. And then you just get to a spot where you want those guys to be your players that are getting 100% of the defensive snaps. And that third safety isn't somebody that's going to play more than, let's say, 40% of the snaps. And maybe PJ Locke, who the Cowboys signed as a free agent, we're going to talk about him in a little bit. Maybe he occupies that spot a little better. Could Malik Hooker, despite we think being a good player, be a potential trade candidate late August, early September?
I would think it would, in the scenario in my head in which that is the outcome, I think it would be more likely in my mind that whoever that it's not so much that the first two guys are just great and you know that they're great, because I think we know that, or that you're going to play less three safety than you think, because I actually think they're going to play a lot of three safety.
So do I.
I think the scenario needs to include one of these kind of down roster safeties really taking a step, and whether that's PJ Locke looking really good in training camp, or Elijah Clark coming out of nowhere and just being a dynamic player that taking a huge step. I think you're going to need someone to actually step up into this role and take that job before you're going to probably feel comfortable trading someone like Hooker away.
Well, and again, we're going to talk about some of these players in a little bit, but I could see a scenario where like Elijah Clark and let's say Zion Childress, I'm looking at my notes right here, are just awesome on special teams. And maybe you don't get the same, players on offense contributing on special teams. And you feel like Clark and Childress are going to be active every single week. And then if you got PJ Locke as your third safety, it's not that Malik Hooker is a bad player, but maybe they feel like he could be expendable. The Cowboys could trade him before week 1 and save $3.8 million. Now that's not a ton of money, right? And I would prefer, again, I'm just making my opinion known, I would prefer they hold on to him because it's hard to find good safeties in the NFL. But if they just want to get younger and more athletic, I won't be totally shocked if the Cowboys did move him at some point.
I wouldn't either. I think like my big point was you better be really certain in what you've got behind him, because I do think that position is going to be, especially because you aren't expecting Caleb Downs to play very much. We'll talk about that here in a sec. You're not actually expecting Caleb Downs to play a ton of back end safety, or at least having at the minimum a 50-50 role down at nickel.
Well,
so it'll be,
and that's the thing I keep coming back to too. It's like, it's 3.8 million savings. Okay. That's not nothing, but we're trying to win this year, and I would rather have that veteran that will at least give you some kind of backstop. Now, maybe he doesn't need to be a 1,000 snap player like he's been over the last 3 years. Maybe it's a 700 snap player, but I think just taking some of the pressure off of Caleb Downs and having veterans like Jalen Thompson and Malik Hooker, to me, it's worth holding on to him and figuring out how to construct a roster elsewhere.
Welcome back to the Big 3 and 30 NFL. Darnell Washington is becoming a central piece in Mike McCarthy's tight end plan for Pittsburgh. Christopher Carter with Locked On Steelers explains the role.
The main topic I want to talk about is a question about the Steelers' style of offense and what it might do involving the tight end position, especially with Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington on this roster and getting paid. I think it's going to be an interesting year because Mike McCarthy has been known for different things in his career as far as how he's wanted to operate it. But one thing that when we looked at consistently was he used a lot of 11 personnel offense. Now, if you don't know what 11 personnel is, of course, that is one running back, one tight end, and then 3 wide receivers. So with the Steelers drafting Jerry Bernard, trading for Michael Pittman Jr., they have DK Metcalf. They're setting themselves up to be able to run a lot more 11 personnel. And when we've talked to Mike McCarthy, and our caller is going to reference this, talking about 90s style offense, there's a bit of a question. Which way are they going to lean as far as how they use their guys? And I think that lets us get into a little bit of an interesting conversation or a thought pattern just about how the Steelers could adapt to what Mike McCarthy's trying to do, but while he adapts to what the Steelers already have on their roster. Here was our man Marlon from Oklahoma City asking that question that got this started.
Hey, Chris, it's Marlon Lewis, a.k.a. Loon from Oklahoma. I've been listening to you talk about how Mike McCarthy is interested in running more of a 90s offense because he has Darnell Washington, and I know everyone's very excited. Could there be a world, though, where it honestly makes the team more versatile because he still can run those 3 wide receiver packages as well as running more 90s schemes like they couldn't do last year with Arthur Smith? Let me know what you think, bro.
Thank you, Marlon, for your question. If you ever want to call in with a question to the Locked On Steelers podcast, all you have to do is call 412-223-6644. Leave your name, where you're from, keep your question under a minute, and we try to get your questions on the show. So let's dial into this a little bit more. So with the Steelers, with getting Darnell Washington, paying Darnell Washington, he's going to be part of the long-term plan. This is the opportunity for the Steelers to say, okay, let's use him in ways that we haven't before. And I actually asked Mike McCarthy about this some weeks ago, back earlier in June, the Steelers were going through OTAs. It was just after they had signed into an extension, and he talked about him being a complete tight end, and him he can line up next to the tackle and block a defensive end one-on-one. That's where he brought up the 90s quote. This is how he played in the 90s, using the tight end this way. And he said he's looking forward to it. And then the follow-up question I had was historically you played 11 personnel through wide receiver sets, and he kind of broke it down after that. He said he looks more at offense when it comes to just running backs, and he said you have a 2-back offense, 1-back offense, and a no-back offense, and your personnel is really dictated by based on your roster. And so I think what you're going to see here, Marlon, is you're going to see Darnell Washington used, but I would not be shocked if the Steelers come out in 12 personnel formations, but use it like 11 personnel formations, where Darnell Washington lines up as the traditional tight end, 3-point stance, hand in the dirt, works next to the right tackle or the left tackle based off of where they want the strength of their formation on that play. But Pat Freiermuth moves around, lining up, as a split end, as a flanker, as a slot, moving him around the formation, and they have sort of a big receiving group where they have DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman, Darnell Washington, Pat Freiermuth as your 4 primary receivers, with one of their running backs, whether it's Jaylen Warren or Rico Dowdle. And the reason I think that could be interesting is that that would be more of what Mike McCarthy was talking about when I asked him about his history of using 11 personnel. And he talked about you kind of use who you have. Now, last year, the Steelers did use 11 personnel more than any other formation. I think that's more natural, though, because in a lot of today's NFL, that's what the offenses call for. But in doing that, they didn't use it as much as other teams. In fact, when they used 11 personnel, they used it 49% of the time, almost half of their plays, but they used it 26th most in the NFL. Compared to every other team, they were near the bottom of the league. They were 8th most in the league when it came to using 12 personnel, which is, again, when 1 running back, 2 tight ends, 2 wide receivers, because again, you can only have 5 playmakers out there, so that's how the personnel is determined. But when you look at that, okay, they were playing to their strengths last year because they didn't have those wide receivers. Now, to your point, they have more of those wide receivers, so they're going to use these guys. But I think what you might see is they still might favor the 11 personnel is going to get used and get used more, but they're still going to, I think, favor 12 personnel because you want both your playmaking tight ends on the field. And maybe this also allows you to rotate your receivers a bit to get different things. Metcalf and Pittman will definitely be the primary top 2, but this might get you in a situation where, hey, maybe we can get Jeremy Bernard in a spot where we think we could work him in the game. I think that could become the sort of art that Mike McCarthy and Brian Angelico work into the offense throughout the season. Now, a comparison to where Mike McCarthy, how he called his offense when his offense was the number 1 scoring offense with the Cowboys, and how things were. They used 11 personnel 61% of the time. So a pretty significant jump from the Steelers. But even that back then, it wasn't the highest usage percentage in the NFL. It was the 22nd most in the NFL. They used 22 formations, which kind of is crazy when you think about it. But 2 backs, 2 tight ends, and 1 running back. But that was again because of what they had at the time. They had an offense that didn't have George Pickens and CeeDee Lamb like they did this past year. But they had Rico Dowdle and Tony Pollard, so they wanted to use them. So another thought here could be, could the Steelers also be using Jaylen Warren and Rico Dowdle a bit differently? Because one thing that, we talked to Rico Dowdle about at one point was, he's lining up all over the offense. He's not just lining up as a traditional running back and asking to bowl over defenders. They're moving him around. He's going to be lining up and moving around as, and not necessarily wide receiver positions, but out wide, motioning out. And that could give the Steelers also options here to kind of combine him with Jaylen Warren to say, hey, either one of these guys could be a running threat and they can have receiving threats as well, while you're also having to consider the new wide receivers they've brought in, their use of their tight ends. I think that's where Mike McCarthy, if he's going to capture the 90s style, it's not going to be an exact replica of any team from the 90s, but it's going to be this sort of push to get the Steelers to say, hey, we're going to come at you. We're going to attack vertically. We're going to be physical. We're going to try to push you off the ball with this offensive line that this team has invested in for so long. But we're also going to attack downfield. But we're also going to force you into certain personnel mismatches with the way that we bring guys out. And I think that could be the secret sauce of the Steelers when you look at what their offense could be this year. They could come out in a formation that looks like a typical shotgun 3 wide receiver set, but one of those wide receivers is Pat Freiermuth. He's tight end. He's lined up there in a position you think Jerry Bernard would be in, or maybe it's Rico Dowdle, and they kind of try to catch you in these positions where you look at the personnel in there, you think, okay, let's bulk up, let's get some bigger linebackers out there, let's take out our nickel package for a sec. But then they spread out as a formation, and now those linebackers that you brought in to stuff the run are in a tough position because now they're trying to cover the pass out wider and cover more space. That could be the trick that I think that Mike McCarthy leans on a bit more this year and does some different things with the personnel packages, because I do think this will probably be the most complete set of playmakers the Steelers have had in quite some time. I mean, because you think back, like, George Pickens was the primary receiver before they traded for DK Metcalf. I didn't really have much of a number 2 option behind him. When it was him and Deontay Johnson, both had their flaws, but both were exciting at one point. But they didn't have, the quarterback situation with a guy that they could really, balance the offense and see the field well the way Aaron Rodgers does. You might look back and say, like, the last time they had this much talent in the offense might have been 2020. When you think back to, them having, Deontay Johnson with Juju Smith-Schuster, and granted, he was hurt for most of the year, so that didn't even count. And they had Chase Claypool, but we've talked about this. Like, this might be since like 2018 or 2017 that the Steelers have had this much collective talent that they could depend upon in their offense. And that's what I think Mike McCarthy has to use to create this 90s style offense that he references, is mix things up, still attack vertical. We talked about last week the intermediate passing game and how that could work into things. I think that this is a really good time for the Steelers to get some of that on board. And again, I think it's really good for the Steelers that they have these young players they've invested in the offensive line, the veterans that they've kept as playmakers and that they've added as playmakers, and that they're setting a stage for, if Aaron Rodgers can make this group work, if they can be a solid, efficient offense this year, it's going to set the table for they can keep this system that they develop in Pittsburgh. And if they draft a young quarterback, then in the first round, then you could have that young quarterback with with Will Howard or with Drew Aller and a bunch of young quarterbacks fighting for playing time, learning how to make that efficient offense work as younger guys in the NFL. I think that could be an interesting period in the Pittsburgh Steelers if they can get there. But again, it all is being set by the table that is this year of a foundation of what is this new Steelers offense under Mike McCarthy going to look like.
That's all for today's Big 3 in 30 NFL. If you follow basketball or college sports, the Big 3 in 30 has shows for the biggest news in the NBA and on campus going up every week just like this one. Just search the Big 3 in 30 NBA or the Big 3 in 30 College wherever you're listening or watching now. Thanks again for tuning in to the Big 3 in 30 NFL.